All right, so if you got your Bibles, we're in Genesis chapter 4 tonight, and I'm really, really excited about this new series that we're starting. We've simply titled it Heroes, and the inspiration behind the series comes from Hebrews chapter 11, and if you're familiar with that chapter, it's a list of names, remarkable, remarkable names, men and women who have come before us, who have been commended by God because of their deep, deep and abiding faith. And that list actually starts with the names of two brothers, Cain and Abel. Now, before we get into their story, I just want to clear a couple of things up for you. And one is this. Their story is found in the book of Genesis. Now, the word Genesis contains the word gene. Because essentially, Genesis and gene mean the same thing. You are what you are because of the playing out of your genes. And in a very similar way, the events in the book of Genesis are played out throughout the rest of the Bible. So in one sense, there really is no new information that follows after Genesis. We see the fall of man, and then we see God's redemptive plan and purpose begin to unfold. The rest of the Bible just gives us the DNA, sort of the blueprints. It's mapped out. So there's really nothing new in that sense outside the book of Genesis. It's important to note that because a lot of times people think that the Bible is it's made up of a loose connection of stories. Maybe they're not even connected at all. Ancient stories, and each story has a moral that's meant to teach us something. That's not really accurate. The Bible is one narrative from Genesis to Revelation. And there are stories contained therein. And those stories reveal to us things about God as God deals with people. And so when we come to Cain and Abel, let me just forewarn you. There is, in our passage tonight, what I think is one of the most vivid verses in the entire Bible. And a lot of times people read it and they just don't, they're not clued into it. It is one of, if not the most vivid verse in the entire Bible. And it's found actually in verse 4. Before we get there though, let's begin with the beginning of the account of these two brothers. Genesis chapter 4, verse 1. It says, now Adam knew Eve, his wife. Knew her in the biblical sense, right? Because look what happens. She conceives and bore Cain. And she says this, I have gotten a man with the help of the Lord. Now, the name Cain literally means to get. To get. So when she says, I have gotten, literally she's saying Cain's name. And then it's interesting because she says, I have gotten a man with the help of the Lord. Well, why would she say God had a hand in bringing this child to bear? Well, if you remember, in Genesis chapter 3, there is a statement by God spoken specifically to Eve. And this is before she's had children. And so to get inside her mind and to be able to track with God as God says these words would have been very interesting to know what she was thinking. Because God says to her, as a result of the fall, as a result of your falling and succumbing to temptation, disobeying me, there will be one who comes forth from you, Eve. And this descendant, if you will ultimately give a death blow to Satan. So she hears that back in Genesis chapter 3. And then in Genesis chapter 4, what happens? She gives birth. She gives birth. No doubt in her mind she's thinking, okay, this happened because why? Because God said it was going to happen. I have gotten a man with the help of the Lord. And again, she bore his brother Abel. Now, there's no mention of another conception, which leads us to believe that Cain and Abel are actually twins. Now, Abel was a keeper of sheep, meaning that he was a shepherd. And Cain was a worker of the ground, meaning he was a farmer. So in the course of time, Cain brought to the Lord an offering. And I'm going to tell you what the Hebrew word is there for offering because it's an important one. It's the word minha. We'll come back to that in a second. In the course of time, Cain brought to the Lord an offering, a minhah of the fruit of the ground. And Abel also brought of the firstborn of his flock and of their fat portions. And the Lord had regard for Abel and his offering, but for Cain and his offering he had no regard. Okay, so you see what's happening? Two brothers are born. In the course of time, they offer sacrifices to God. Cain brings fruit of the ground. Abel brings the firstborn of his flock and the fat portions. God looks upon favor with Abel's offering, but not on Cain's. Why? Well, there are many commentators who believe that the reason why God rejected Cain's offering is because God was commanding a blood sacrifice, which would require an animal. And so because Cain did not bring a blood sacrifice, but instead brought produce from the ground, he was being disobedient. And so that's the reason why God didn't approve of Cain's offering. It was disobedient. The challenge with that is that the text doesn't explicitly say why God rejected Cain's offering. Personally, I think the meaning, the understanding, is actually wrapped up in that word minhah. Let me explain it to you. There's an interesting word used for sacrifice. It doesn't explicitly refer to blood sacrifice. It refers to a dedication sacrifice. There's a difference. Now, in a dedication sacrifice, what you're saying is, everything that I have belongs to you, God. So in that sense, produce from the ground, perfectly acceptable. An animal, perfectly acceptable. In and of themselves, the produce or the animal as an offering to God, both of them in and of themselves were perfectly acceptable. So there must be something more. There must be something more. Why would God reject Cain's, accept Abel's, if both of the sacrifices, and that is what they were sacrificing, was acceptable to God? We actually get a clue. In Hebrews chapter 11, verse 4, we read this: by faith, Abel offered to God a more acceptable sacrifice than Cain, through which he was commended as righteous, God commending him by accepting his gifts. And through his faith, though he died, he still speaks. So in other words, even though Cain's dead, the way he lived his life and what happened in this story still speaks to us today. How was Abel's sacrifice more acceptable, the text says, than Cain's? Well, Abel's was by faith. Let me explain what's happening here. This is an important point. We're told that Abel offered essentially the best of what he has. Notice what the text says. It says, he brought the firstborn of his flock and the fat portions. The fat portions represented the best part. Firstborn, that is an act of faith, and here's why. You weren't certain that your animals were going to give birth again. You follow? So if you're giving the firstborn, what are you doing? You're saying, well, I trust God. What is faith? Trust. I trust that my animals will keep producing because here you go. Here's the firstborn. Now you're going to have to wait a few more months before you get more livestock or you get more cattle, before more are born. So this is a real act of faith on Abel's part. Now, notice, nowhere in the text does it say that Cain brought what? First fruits. It simply says that he brought fruit from the ground. But there's an emphasis on the quality. You follow? On the quality of what Abel brought. So in 1 John chapter 3, verse 12, we're told this: we should not be like Cain, who is of the evil one, and murdered his brother. And why did he murder him? Because his own deeds were evil and his brother's righteous. So there was something going on inside Cain, apart from what the offering itself was. Matthew chapter 5, Jesus gives a very simple principle. And let me set it up by saying this. You got to know that first and foremost, God is always, always, always concerned most about the heart. Look what he says in Matthew chapter 5. So if you are offering your gift at the altar, and you're there and you remember, you know what? I have a brother that has something against me. In other words, I've done something wrong. I've offended that brother. And I just remembered that. But you're there and you're getting ready to present your offering to God. Leave it. Just leave it. Leave your gift there before the altar and go. First, be reconciled to your brother, and then come and offer your gift. In other words, God always inspects the giver before he inspects the gift. You got to get that. God always inspects the giver before he inspects the gift. It's been this way all throughout the history of mankind. You know, it's like David. You know, David gets chosen as God's man, and everybody else looks at him and he's like, man, what, that guy? Everybody's looking at the outward appearance, and God says, no, I'm going to tell you, I look at the heart, and I can tell you, this guy's got a good heart, and that's why it falls to him. You see it all throughout the Bible, and there's this heart that's repentant and obedient. That's what's making the sacrifice acceptable, and so it's really obvious to see that Cain's heart wasn't in the right place because of how Cain responds to his offering being rejected. Oh, by the way, I don't have the exact answer to this question, but I was thinking about it as I was reading through the text this week. How did Cain know that his offering was not acceptable? The text doesn't say that the voice of God spoke. Let me just offer you a suggestion. Could it be that as time went on, Cain saw that the favor of God was not on his life because he was not living in faith and trust and dependence upon God? Meanwhile, he sees his brother Abel, and Abel's being blessed by God. Now his sin has been exposed. Now when your sin is exposed, you will react, you will respond in one of two ways. You're either going to bow your heart or it will stiffen. And unfortunately for Cain, well, look how it plays itself out. So Cain was very angry, and his face fell. So when your face falls, you know what that looks like, right? When your face is uplifted, you're smiling, you're happy. But when your face falls, you're upset, you're mad, and it's a reflection of what's going on inside your heart. See, it would have been good for Cain to say, man, I got to get this right. I got to get this right. I mean, clearly God is not pleased with me right now. There's something going on, and I need to take notice, and I need to make this right. But instead, he says, I'm angry. I'm angry. So God says, how dare you get angry at me? How dare you? Do you know who I am? You're the one who's wrong. No. See, God is a really good parent. Kind, gracious, merciful. Why are you angry? See, he's giving him an opportunity to turn things around. And why has your face fallen? God knows the answer, but it's a setup. To verse 7. See, Cain, if you do well, will you not be accepted? Cain, you can make things right. And you really need to. Because here's what you need to know about what you're on the brink of right now. This is the harsh reality of your life in this moment. And here it is. This is, I think, the most profound statement about sin in the entire Bible. Look what it says. And if you don't do well, sin is crouching at the door, and its desire is contrary to you. but you must rule over it. This is an extraordinarily insightful take on sin, description of sin. See the word crouching? This is a fascinating word. It was used to describe tigers and leopards when they crouched low, just before they were about to pounce. A couple years ago, in my neighborhood, there was a stray cat. And then one day I realized this cat's spending a lot of time at my house. I'm like, what's up with this cat? Then I realized that Jill, my wife, started feeding it sardines. And it didn't leave. It hasn't left. Now I gotta say, this cat, for a cat, is unusually likable because it kind of acts like a dog. It'll walk up to you. It'll roll on its side, like a dog, like it wants you to pet its stomach. This is really, really doing. I'm in the backyard reading a book, and the cat walks by one afternoon, and I watch it as it climbs a tree. And it's just sitting in the tree. Then all of a sudden, a bird lands in the same tree. You know what the cat did? Crouched low, got real small. You know what it's trying to do? Check this out. Sin is crouching. You know what that means? It's trying to hide itself. You stop and think about that for a moment. That's what's being said here. God's saying, you got to be real careful now, because you see sin is crouching. It's hiding itself. A few years ago, my friend was out of town. His wife called me and said, Jason, there is a rattlesnake in the front yard. Can you come over and remove it? So I grab a golf club. I head over there. By the time I get there, the snake is coiled up in the corner next to the front door. Snakes coil for a couple of reasons. Number one, to make themselves a smaller target, but number two, because they're getting ready to strike. So I'm out there with a golf club, okay? My friend's daughters are looking through the big glass window in the front of the house, right? I tell my friend's wife, I'm like, can you please close the blinds? Because I don't want to see them I don't want them to see me get bit, right? Or to see me act like a junior high girl through this whole thing. So I'm trying to mess with the snake, and so I'm taking the club, and I'm kind of doing this thing, and it never struck, but man, it took off, and it started coming toward me. It scared me to death. It was just sitting there crouching. It was just crouching. It was just waiting. It was laying low. This is a crazy way to describe sin, but it's so, so good. Because here's the thing. We tend to think that it's not that big of a deal. It's always there, always present, but in the background. In the background. And if we can continue to believe that it's there, but it's in the background, it will always have a presence in our lives. Then God says, its desire is contrary to you. In other words, what that describes is, you have certain things that you want for your life. Sin is contrary to that. It contradicts that. So you want to live a life of meaning and purpose? Sin is contrary to that. See, in that sense, sin is stupid. It doesn't make sense. It's not rational. You think that by sinning you will get what you want, and certainly maybe temporarily, but it's not what you want for your life. Then he goes on and he says, you must rule over it, which implies that it has the ability to rule over you. Sin always hides itself. And then secondly, you have to understand what God is explaining is this. Sin is far more powerful than you ever thought. Anna Arendt was a Jewish intellectual, and she wanted to be present when the famous Nazi Eichmann was on trial. They captured him in Argentina, and they put him on trial in front of a court of Jews. And she actually writes an essay about that experience. And she says something fascinating. She says, you know what was so unnerving about that? It was just absolutely unnerving being in the room and hearing Eichmann talk and give testimony. It was absolutely unnerving because Eichmann seemed so ordinary. He seemed so ordinary. He seemed like a lot of the other guys Eichmann was the one that essentially was the architect of the Holocaust. I mean, just to know that the inhumane crimes that he committed, and yet she said, he seemed so ordinary. Eichmann was one of many of those types, she would go on to explain. Men who would, during the day, oversee the torture and killings of countless Jews in a concentration camp, and then at night they would get in their cars and they would drive home. And then on the way home, they would stop by the store and pick up things like milk and butter, whatever items their wives requested. Then they would eat dinner around the table with their families, and they would help their kids with homework. On the weekends, they would shop for birthday presents for their children. Later at night, after eating dinner, they would gather around and they would listen to Wagner. They would read philosophy. They would drink fine wine. They just seemed so ordinary. And then they would wake up and they would drop their kids off at school and then pull up to the concentration camp and start it all over again. She said it was so unnerving to see ordinary people, seemingly ordinary people, do the most inhumane things. Because sin hides itself and because sin is far more powerful than you think, it is our tendency to not see the monster that is inside of us. You understand what I'm saying? It's really easy not to see the monster that is inside of us. A lady walked up to a pastor and said, well, Pastor, I want to be honest with you. I want to be honest. I want to be totally honest with you. And so I want to let you know that I really do. I struggle with my anger. I do. I struggle with my anger, and I struggle with it a lot. But I also want you to know this. It's over quickly. It's over quickly. And she smiled. And the pastor said, you know what else is over quickly? A nuclear bomb. An earthquake. A bullet. That leaves a gun pretty quickly. There's always that tendency to minimize what's going on in our own lives, the things that we involve ourselves in that we think, it's not that big of a deal. And it's exactly as God describes. It's this picture of sin sitting there. It's crouching, but it's just waiting. It's like that rattlesnake that's coiled up. Many, many years ago, a newspaper asked the question. They actually sent the question to many famous authors at that time, and the question was, what is wrong with the world? To which the philosopher G.K. Chesterton wrote back, I am, period. There is an incredible amount of self-awareness there. Very few of us really fully realize that monster that sin actually is in our lives. And what I think is fascinating about God's approach with Cain is he doesn't give him a 7-step program to ridding yourself of sin. Instead, he says, do you understand how it works? You wouldn't go to bed next to a coiled up rattlesnake, would you? That's sin in your life. So when you look at that seductive image on the computer screen, that's like having a rattlesnake stare you in the face. That's what it's like. And you're about to get bit. It's like a tiger that's ready to pounce on you. But what you do is you minimize it because it wants to keep itself hidden. And it's far more powerful than you think because as you give into it again and again, what does it say? It's going to rule you. So you have to understand first and foremost just how destructive it is. And because God is the only creature worthy of our worship, he's doing us a great favor by saying, your worship is misplaced unless it's placed in me. That's why God gets upset when we don't give him our best. Because it's like this. Imagine a guy who has a beautiful ring, And he approaches his fiancée after 2 years, and he says, give me your hand. She gives him her hand, and he takes the ring and places it on her finger, and he says, will you marry me? And she begins to cry, and she says, of course, yes, I'll marry her. And he says, that's fantastic. That's so great. You're the third one today. She's thinking, wait, what? What? Excuse me? Yeah, I asked these other 2 girls earlier, and I've been seeing them for the last 2 years also, and they both said yes as well. What is the girl going to do with that ring? She's going to take it off. She's going to throw it at him. Why? Because what's she saying? Are you not going to be devoted to me? Are you going to be divided like that? Am I not worthy of having this ring all to myself? Do you get the picture with God now? Do you get the picture with God now? It's like taking whatever ring that's labeled whatever sin it is that you worship, that you give yourself to, being devoted to. And see, that's what was going on in Cain's heart. See, the problem with Cain is, now check this out. This is really crazy. Cain wanted to be moral. Think it through. Because what does he do? He brings an offering. It's not like he says, what does God, forget that, I'm not giving him anything, right? Goes chewing on his own carrot, right? He's like, no. He's like, he comes to God and he says, God, here's an offering. But here's the problem. He gave what he wanted, not what God was worthy of. Question. Are there Christian-type Cains in the church? Don't answer out loud. He gave what he wanted, not what God was worthy of. You see the difference? It's a big difference there. In other words, he's handing out more than one ring. And God's saying, I'm more worthy than that. And secondly, this is going to be really bad for you. Because any other thing that you decide to put a ring on is going to bite you. It's going to master you. And so, Cain doesn't listen, verse 8. Cain spoke to Abel, his brother. You know, it's really interesting. We don't have any details of what he said. Although the Septuagint, which is a Greek version of the Old Testament, what happened was when the Jews were dispersed, they began to enter lands and territories where the Hebrew language was not spoken. And so at a certain point in time, many of the Jews they just spoke Greek. And so they didn't speak Hebrew anymore. So they needed a Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament. And so that was the Septuagint. And so at this point, the Septuagint adds this. Cain spoke to Abel, his brother, and said, let us go out to the fields. So if that's what Cain said to Abel, you can see the setup that's about to happen. Hey, Cain, let's go out to the fields. You know, I've got some stuff growing out there I want to show you. And when they were in the field, Cain rose up against his brother Abel and killed him. It was crouching. It was at his door. And he opened the door and he got pounced on. Then the Lord said to Cain, where is Abel, your brother? Now, does God know where Abel is? Yeah. This is God's way of giving him the opportunity to come clean, to repent. He said, I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper? And that response in our house is what we call sass. That's a little sass mouth, right? Am I my brother's keeper? Patronizing, condescending. Again, a reflection of where Cain's heart is. And the Lord said, what have you done? The voice of your brother's blood is crying to me from the ground. So this is interesting. This gives you a little bit of a clue as to what happened. This wasn't a blunt force to the head. Cain opened him up. There are some commentators who believe that this was a form of blood sacrifice from Cain. You want a blood sacrifice? You want something more acceptable? And so here's the penalty, because God does discipline those whom he loves. And now you are cursed from the ground, which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you work the ground, it shall no longer yield to you its strength. In other words, you've just lost all your livelihood as a farmer. You shall be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth. That's rough. Cain understands. I'm going to have no place to call home. Cain said to the Lord, my punishment is greater than I can bear. Behold, you have driven me today away from the ground, and from your face I shall be hidden. I shall be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth, and whoever finds me will kill me. There's still a certain sense of self-loathing there, thinking of himself. But God is gracious, verse 15. And the Lord said to him, not so. If anyone kills Cain, vengeance shall be taken on him sevenfold. And the Lord put a mark on Cain. What kind of mark? We don't know exactly, but it was one that let others know that any who found him should attack him. If they did, it would be vengeance sevenfold. Then Cain went away from the presence of the Lord and settled in the land of Nod, east of Eden. Last week I mentioned the importance of being involved with a group of believers that knows you. To be known and to know others is crucial to a healthy and vibrant Christian life. Here's the thing, and again, I'm at the front of this line, okay, when I say this. We all have our blind spots. We all have a tendency to be quick to see the sin in others, and we're really slow to see it in ourselves. This is why you need good Christian friends. I was talking with a friend of mine this week, and he reminded me of a saying. You know, really bad friends, enemies, will stab you in the back, but great friends will stab you in the front. In other words, they're able to say things to you for your benefit, for your health, for your edification, for your spiritual growth. And I mentioned it last week, and I want to mention it again. Being part of a church means that you're with others. You're in the context of being known and opening up your life and sharing it with others. And if people were to ask me, hey, I've only got 2 hours to give to the church, I'd say, well, your time needs to be better prioritized. But let me tell you this, an hour at church on Saturdays and then an hour in a community group where people can know you, where they can help you, where it's that environment where your spiritual roots can grow deeper. Because sin's desire is toward you. It wants to have you. And you don't have to be a Christian to believe that it's true. Sin will control you. You don't have to be a Christian to know that that's a true statement. I could get a lot of people up here on this stage who don't know God, don't know Jesus, and they will give witness to the fact that sin has controlled them, that they're being controlled by something in their lives that they don't want, but that they've given themselves to. Every little grudge is a little, in seed form, the act of murder waiting to happen. Every little bit of self-pity is just an attempt to grab the spotlight and put it on yourself. Every little seed of anger is just an atom bomb waiting to explode. So, friends, I have been wrestling with this all week. And now it's your turn. If there was ever a passage to apply the words of James, be doers of the words, not merely hearers. But see, that doing begins with a clear understanding of the devastation and destruction that is going on with inside each one of us, to say, that's the monster. But I refuse to let it master me. But I need help. I need the help of my brothers and sisters. You can go online. You can sign up for a community group. We've got some of the most amazing people leading those groups. They want nothing more than to open up their homes, their hearts, and their lives to you. But that's your responsibility. Let's pray. Father, it's never easy when we talk about this subject, and certainly the powers of darkness take notice because they do not want it brought to light. But Father, that's what we're doing. You make it known to us. You help us see it for what it is. And Father, really it is a matter of ascribing worth to you above anything else, not letting anything else master us, but being wholly devoted to you. And then, Lord, we experience the blessings that come from that. Father, for every person in this room, I know what it is for me. I can relate to the anger. I can relate to the bitterness. I've got it all. Every single one of us, Lord. I pray that by the power of your Spirit, you'd speak to us, and that your word, your truth, your people would prove to be a salve, and that we would gain healing from this. We ask this in the name of your Son, Jesus Christ. And God's people said, amen.